forewarn you, we're like we have done with all the talks so far, we're Facebook streaming right now. The camera's up there, and it will be on YouTube after this. So if you're wanted in any jurisdiction, you may want to leave now. Thank you for coming this afternoon for the warm talks for Cold Winds Talk Series. I can't believe it. We're almost to the end. This is the second to the last one. It's made the, I hope for you, I know for me, it's made the winter go by so much faster. And after the last three where I joked about that I should have called them warm talks for cool winds, Mother Nature said, hold my beer. And we've been through a wicked the last 2 days. Today's just beautiful out there. So I'm glad you could make it and join us. The next one, the last one is Jay Williamson, who next Sunday at 2 o'clock will be talking about Tristan Dalton. And Jay promises that his take on Tristan and Tristan's role in Newburyport society is very different and very controversial. So I'm sure you want to join us on February 12th for that. I'll make my usual pitch. If you're not a member, you should be a member. And if you're not a member of the Museum of Old Newbury, you should be a member of the Museum of Old Newbury too. And that's how we are able to pull these off and have these talks and wonderful exhibits and everything that we do at the Custom House Maritime Museum. And on that note, I just want to say this is just a great example of how the two local history museums are collaborating. And you know, Bethany, when we ask her for something from the Custom House, it's always like, when? I can come over right now, whatever you need. So we really appreciate that. It's just fantastic.
Just like to hang out with Jack.
And the museums are all working very well together and just very complementary in terms of what we're addressing in the history aspects of the history of Newburyport that we're addressing. So without further ado, if you don't know Bethany Groff Dorau, the old cliche is someone who needs no introduction, but then you go ahead and give an introduction. Well, I'll go ahead and do that briefly. And I didn't ask Bethany for any notes beforehand, so I had to go to the most authoritative source I know, Facebook. And Bethany, according to Facebook, Bethany is the executive director at the Museum of Old Newbury and has been there since 2021. But before that, she was the regional manager at Historic New England for, and this must be in this script, 21 years. You just started at 5. Is that, oh my gosh.
It's actually 72 years old.
Wow, yeah. So at Spencer Pierce Little Farm, I'm sure you'll know that she was up there for a while, and went to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst for a master's in history. Hails from West Newbury, but before that, and I had to look this up, Fort St. John, British Columbia. I did a Google Maps. You can't get there from here.
No.
It's way up north. God.
Hardly get that from Edmonton.
Well, excellent. So with that, and talking about women and negotiation sculpture as part of legendary Newburyport, let me introduce Bethany Groff Dorau.
A big thanks to Jack and to everybody here at the Custom House, at the museum, and all of you, of course, who came out here today, and of course, Jeff Briggs and Jack and everyone who's been part of this project. It's been really a blast getting to work with everyone in this way. And I also need to start with an apology. I'm not accustomed to using my laptop for my notes, but we were one of the lucky ones who had pipes burst in the wall frying the electrical system in the house. So there's been minimal, it's been a sort of a frantic morning and with limited functionality electronically, so here we go. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background on my role in this process. I'm sure that most of you have gotten quite familiar with this show, and I was brought in sort of 11th hour. I'm a bit of a late addition to the exhibit. I hope Jeff is forgiven, Skip and Marge, for dragging me in late in the game. I had some conversations with Jeff early on in this process around the sculpture of Anna Jakes, but it was not until the planning group decided that there needed to be more representation of women in the show. There was at that time one. that Skip and Marge dragged me in and asked me if I could be part of this. My background is in women's history, in addition to several other aspects, but I have I am a woman. It is a particular interest of mine, and in this area, I find, of course, that it informs everything we do here, but so often it needs to be investigated in different ways, or sort of against the grain than looking at sort of prominent men in this community. So you're not going to pick up a biography of notable Newburyporters that was printed in the 1940s and find, equal representation of men and women. Although I would argue that they were everywhere, we were everywhere, and cannot be discounted from history, although we may be harder to research. So this is going to be a little bit of a stump speech, in case you can't tell already. I'm not sure I was an easy addition to the team, the planning team for this exhibition, though I hope my contributions have been meaningful. I'm just enough of a contrarian that when someone asks me to write a piece about how women were in the 18th century and early 19th century, I get obstreperous. Why? Partly because I've never found any group of women that is not also shaped by race, class, ethnicity, wealth, personality, experience, generation, etc. So go ahead and think about this with me for a moment. Imagine that in 200 years, a historian is looking at magazine articles about women, representations of women in the media, legal cases, data like pay differentials, etc., in the 21st century. How would that historian finish this sentence? Women in the 21st century were. What are we? You can't really answer that easily, can you? And I can't really answer that easily for women in the 18th, early 19th century either. You can make sweeping generalizations that the experience of women is and has always been very complicated. It's even difficult to talk about what it means to be a woman, as gender identity is also quite complicated. So how then do you talk about women in the past? First, I would like to ask you to do what I asked poor Jeff to do. Start with a lived experience. Start with an actual person or group of people, rather than a generalized population. Get to know as much as you can know about actual women and go from there. I'm much more comfortable with this approach. And so we picked a year, 1771, and we identified 3 women and a child. And what I think Jeff has done really brilliantly is to represent through the sculpture entitled Negotiations. Now we get to know who in the audience has the same ringtone. I love that. If it was a train whistle, I'd be rooting around in my bed right now. We identified 3 women and a child. So I think what this sculpture really does beautifully is to represent the tension on multiple levels that women felt and still feel in the context of race and class. So there's a lot of movement. I'm a historian, not an artist, as anyone who's ever seen me try to paint or draw anything will tell you. But I love the movement in this piece. I love the way that the child is being restrained, the women are leaning in or leaning back. You can tell a lot. It's amazing how much thought went into this and how much, the motivation of the people who were being sculpted was considered. So I found that it was a struggle to say, well, she probably would have done this because it's a stretch. Ruth Cooper Dalton had 10 children. She's not sitting down to write in, Dear Diary, today I was modestly inconvenienced by a woman in the street. It just didn't happen. We have almost nothing from her in her own voice. What we have is very public-facing, or in letters with her friends, rather than, again, her personal feelings about things. So you have to sort of read into interactions in this way. So let's begin. I know, again, you've all seen this, but there is an enslaved woman represented in this sculpture. She was, as you can imagine, the most difficult of the 3 figures to research, and the one who, if you get it wrong, I think does the most damage. So, in 1754, the Massachusetts governor, William Shirley, ordered a count of all enslaved people, male and female, over age 16. Newbury, there was not yet a Newburyport, responded with 34 males and 16 females. This is 1754. That is the last comprehensive count of enslaved people in Newburyport. There's precious little information about the lives of enslaved women in Newburyport in the 1770s. We know that some enslaved men were emancipated on the eve of the American Revolution. Their enslavers' consciences sort of pricked by all of the discussion of liberty and freedom that led up to the Revolution. We also know that enslaved women were emancipated in Newbury in the decades that preceded the Revolution. There is a case of Matthias Plant, who was a minister here, who freed, and I'll say freed with air quotes because this is how he freed his enslaved woman, Lucy. In 1753, he said, quote, this is in his will, I bequeath unto my Negro girl Lucy her freedom after the decease of my widow, Lydia Plant. One hopes that she was not a much younger bride. But if her behavior be dishonest and stubborn, then this is my bequest of freedom and land. This is my bequest. Freedom and land given to her and her assigns shall be void and of no effect, and my good widow shall dispose of her. So I'm not sure this is full emancipation. This is, I die, you take good care of my wife until she dies, and if you screw up at all, it's all rescinded. So it's a little bit of a sort of hammer. And this is, of course, a time when, as Jeff pointed out during the study, that enslaved people were part of a household in very intimate ways, and so it was important that control be maintained. And there was always this tension, between people who trusted enslaved people with their children and with their livelihood, and they lived in the house, but there are all these subtle and not subtle ways to exercise control over these people. And that was a great example. That's been read as, Matthias Plant, yay, he freed his enslaved people. Well, he did, but he also used it as a club. Lucy and most other enslaved women in Newbury were intimate enough with their enslavers that their compliance was crucial to a well-ordered household. Those who were not living on farms were generally domestic workers, often caring for the children, the sick, and the elderly, and the care of children is represented in the sculpture. We also know, in 1765, there's a woman whose name I screw up all the time. It's Mary Morgaridge. That might be a familiar name to some extent. There's got to be somebody here who's going to correct my pronunciation of that one. Morgaridge, yeah. The executrix of her husband's will, you didn't know that, was credited 44 pounds, 8 shillings and 10 pence for a Negro for the care of children. So she had rented out at least one, probably more enslaved women, as a source of income to her. She was running her husband's businesses. So she is also using other enslaved women as a source of income. It is known that there are 3 enslaved people in the 1771 valuation for the Dalton family. And this is a funny chart because it says, warehouses, square feet of wharf, and servants for life. 1771, servants for life. This is the euphemism that we're using at this point because it's becoming a little bit troublesome to say slaves. The only named woman who may have been enslaved in the Dalton household is Flora, who married Fortune on August 3rd, 1797. The death of their son Primus, presumably in infancy, was reported in 1802. So it is unlikely, though not impossible, that she was an adult in 1771 when this sculpture was set, and could therefore be a model for this piece. Fortune and Flora are buried in Old Hill Cemetery with stones and epitaphs provided by Tristram Dalton. Fortune's stone is still in existence. It's quite elaborate for its time, and it refers to him as a faithful servant of Tristram Dalton. Another contemporary record comes from the estate of William Davenport, who was the owner of the Wolf Tavern, which was then located at State and Threadgill Alley. He died in September 1773, and the inventory of his estate includes, quote, a Negro woman valued at 3 pounds and a Negro child valued at 7 pounds. So you all know where the Dalton Club is, right? There are at least 2 enslaved black women living on State Street within a block of each other. And there probably were more. At the same time, of course, this is 1771, 73. So even as the colony ready to fight for their liberties, Newburyport declined to pursue the same for the enslaved people in their midst. On August 8, 1775, the town did not signify that they disapproved of slavery or the keeping of slaves. There was a warrant added that could be voted on to instruct their representatives to use his utmost endeavors in the general court that slaves in this colony be set at liberty. Newburyport did not pass this motion. Now, this is not uncomplicated because at the same time, an enslaved man named Caesar in Newburyport several years earlier had applied for and won his freedom, even though there was a bill of sale for him. So, this is this messy time where, again, if anyone was going to say slavery was abolished in 1783, well, yes and no. In some cases, there were cases before the Massachusetts Constitution that allowed people to go free. There were numerous people applying for their freedom. Some won, some didn't win. They often won on a legal technicality. And there were people who were still kept in what he would all define as bondage long after the institution of slavery was eliminated in the passing of the Constitution. So I think that was 1789, not 1783. At any rate, Fortune and Flora, who lived at the State Street Dalton residence, were married again in 1797. They're buried at Old Hill. Fortune's gravestone says, "A faithful servant, died July 16, 1804, erected by Tristram Dalton." So Michael Dalton, the father of Tristram, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot more about Tristram next week. He built the State Street Dalton house, died in 1770. So in 1771, again, they're living here on State Street, and there's also there's at least one enslaved person working at the Wolf Tavern, the Davenport Wolf Tavern. So there's no question of property rights for Flora, at least not when she was enslaved, and likely her situation changed little after slavery became servitude. One is left to wonder how she found moments of freedom and autonomy amid the demands of her day. She is the hardest to represent. There are very few paintings, sculptures, portraits of Black women in the 1770s that exist that would show anything like dress, hairstyle, shoes, that sort of thing. So Jeff was very careful to look pretty far afield. We certainly assisted with that to find models for her to be physically represented that were appropriate to the period of time and also to the area. So Ruth Cooper Dalton was a little bit easier to research. She's certainly easier to locate in the record. We found a lot more about her and even some writing in her voice. So let's look first at Ruth Cooper Dalton's family. She was born on August 5th, 1739 in Marblehead. She was the second child and eldest daughter of Robert King Cooper. For those of you who are familiar with Marblehead, he's sort of a legend. He was called King because he had almost total control of the fishing fleet in and out of Marblehead. He was sort of one grand scion of Marblehead along with Jeremiah Lee. And those families were intertwined as well. Jeremiah Lee's daughter married Nathaniel Tracy, who, of course, is the man who lived in the library. Everybody's all intertwined in all these families. There was immediately a Newbury connection because Robert King Cooper's wife and Ruth's mother was Ruth Sweat. So we all know the Sweat family from Newbury. The Sweats are among the first settlers of Newbury. Little's known about Ruth Cooper's earlier life. The household would have been a busy one. Her mother was constantly pregnant, ultimately giving birth to 11 children before her death at age 46. 5 of these children did not survive to adulthood. So you also have to imagine that as the eldest daughter, anyone who comes from a large family will tell you the eldest daughter becomes sort of a second mother. And in fact, Ruth Cooper Dalton took in several of her siblings after her mother's death at 46. Ruth Cooper lived in the center of a powerful extended family. Her aunt, Martha Sweat, was married to Jeremiah Lee, the other most powerful merchant in Marblehead. Their daughter, Ruth's younger cousin, Mary Lee, would go on to marry Nathaniel Tracy in 1775. Ruth's marriage to Newburyport's Tristram Dalton on October 1758 was an opulent affair indeed. From a 1787 Standard History of Essex County, Massachusetts, we find the following description. This is incidentally exactly what I did on my wedding day to James Thoreau in the background. Just imagine this. Bethany Groff on her marriage to James Thoreau. Just kidding. Tristram Dalton on his marriage with Miss Cooper of Marblehead. Ruth reached home in this style, reached Newburyport in this style. His splendid new carriage was drawn by 6 white horses, decorated with white feathers. They hold 4 outriders and footmen and coachmen dressed in new liveries. They rode down State Street with the carriage top thrown back. I arrived and pulled by 4 elderly goats. Just kidding, that's really all we had. Ruth Cooper Dalton seems to be the first link in a mass relocation of Hooper siblings, of which there were not so many survivors, to Newburyport. In 1763, her sister Alice married Jacob Fowle, F-O-W-L-E, obviously a familiar name. In 1764, her brother Stephen married Sarah Woodbridge of Newburyport. In 1766, her brother Joseph married Mary Harris, also of Newburyport. So she's got a sister and 2 brothers. So there's 4 of the 7 surviving siblings that have now relocated to Newburyport. Ruth and Tristram's first recorded child was Michael Dalton, named for Tristram Dalton's father. He was born in 1761. He died at 14 months in April of 1762. The next Michael is born 6 months later and also dies at just over a year old. Their daughter Mary was born in 1764, also died at 14 months. She was the first of 3 babies named Mary, only the last one lived, which is, of course, why there were 3. There may be more. These are the babies whose deaths were recorded. Miscarriages and stillbirths were still often unreported during this time. They still had a sort of a taint left over from the 17th century, evidencing the displeasure of God or an unhealthy family. So quite often miscarriages and stillbirths were not reported. Ruth Hooper Dalton, named for her mother, was born 2 years later and thrived. And when Robert Hooper Dalton, named after her father, was born 2 years later and made it past the 2-year mark, the family must have rejoiced only to see him die at age 7 in 1775. It is this child who is depicted in the sculpture. In the end, 3 of the 10 children that Ruth Hooper Dalton gave birth to survived to adulthood, all daughters. So amid cycles of pregnancy, birth, childcare, and death, it's hard to know just what Ruth Hooper Dalton's life was like in 1771, how she thought of herself. And of course, in addition to having children, she was also engaged in managing her household, sustaining relationships crucial to the family business, engaging in charitable work, and again, always while pregnant, bereaved, nursing, etc. So we certainly can't say she's not working, right? We know that Ruth Hooper Dalton was caught, as were many women of her time, between the politics of her father and her husband. Her husband sort of seems to have been a little bit blowing in the wind until 1774, when he settled in as a strict patriot. Her father, however, was a loyalist whose dedication to the crown and the loan of his Danvers house to General Gage resulted in his total ruin after the war. This was also an interesting time, I think, to be a woman. You imagine her with the livery and the 6 white horses and all that. Well, all that she had in the world was very precarious, and it was very precarious for her husband as well. This is the time when there were more people who lost everything of this sort of class. People that were very wealthy before the war that lost everything after the war and ended up sort of depending on the charity of their friends. And I would argue that in a lot of these cases, it was the women's relationships with other women that helped to continue these relationships that could take care of a family like the Dalton family. We'll talk about one particularly powerful relationship of hers. She spent her whole life caring for her husband's households in New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C., reinforcing her relationships with the other women of the day through correspondence and visits. I'm going to wait for this. I'm going to read this letter, because this is not the right music with which to read this letter. So she was a lifelong correspondent with Abigail Adams. So when I think about Ruth, again, you have to read in between the lines when you look at these women. You look at who they were friends with. You look at facts that can illustrate their lives, like when they were pregnant, when they had children and family members that died or moved. And you can sort of read about their lives through those things. And so her relationship with Abigail Adams is very interesting. So John Adams and Tristram Dalton went to Harvard together. It wasn't quite the same then as it is now, but they graduated at 15 and 17. I can't remember which was which, but they had a lifelong relationship. Tristram Dalton went up fast. John Adams went up a bit more slowly, and then Tristram Dalton came down, and John Adams sort of kept going up and playing up, and you know the story. So we have this interesting interplay where sometimes Abigail Adams is solicitous of Ruth Hooper Dalton, asking her for introductions or favors, and then by the 1780s, 1790s, you see that turn completely around, where now Ruth Hooper Dalton is writing to her old friend and saying things like, this is from 1779, "Whatever accounts you may hear in the future, I trust you will with your usual candor acquaint me. I hope you will never have reason to doubt our friendship, which you may rest assured is as firm as it has been long." In other words, can you keep an eye on things out there and let me know what's going to happen, because her husband's position in government is sort of shaky. She wants to know where the wind's blowing. So there are a lot of these letters in the 1790s between her and Abigail Adams. She also name drops a good bit. She talks about how she just went to see the Washingtons, and they were asking after everyone, sort of thing. So she's reinforcing her relationships with other women to forward the family interests, the interests of her family as well. her daughter, who had the same name as she had, was also very good friends with the Adams' daughter, Nabby, whose name was also Abigail. All right. See, whenever I get into these things, I sort of fall in love with these people. So I did a whole lot more research on Ruth Verdal than I could possibly tell you. Believe me, no one here on it, but it was wonderful. Ruth Verdal was the only person in this sculpture that would not have explicitly worked outside of her home. And I mean, the home, if there's an enslaved person that's forced to live in your house, is that their home? I would argue not. So we're going to say enslaved people also worked outside their home. If we were to examine Ruth Hoover's life from a purely legal and theoretical point of view, we would find her a perfect target for the law, for the rule of coverture, sort of the prevailing wisdom around women of the day. So in 1769, William Blackstone, who was commenting on the laws of England, which was still very much, influenced the way that people were treated here, we're still, in fact, a colony, said, by marriage, the husband and wife are one person according to the law. That is, the very being and legal essence of the woman is suspended during marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of her husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. She is called in French a femme couvert, or she, and there's something, it's a complicated twist where it says she's under the protection and influence of her husband, her baron, her lord, and her condition during her marriage is called her coverture. In other words, anything a woman does or is legally at the time is in her husband's name and under her husband's protection, right? So if you started off looking at Ruth Verdal's life and you used that as the standard by which you were going to judge the way she lived her life, you would miss a whole lot of how people actually lived. Because this is first of all, totally not true. It's not actually an accurate read of how people are living in Newburyport at the time. There are many, many real problems with the statute, the idea of coverture. There are many, of course, risks involved in it too. There were plenty of women in a port town who had to live outside of the ideal of coverture. In other words, there were a lot of women whose husbands had died, who were running businesses and signing legal contracts in their husbands' absences. So there's a whole lot of real life that does not conform to the standard. There also is, of course, race. Women, enslaved women, were under the legal protection of no one. They were enslaved. They were not considered people in that way. And in fact, in terms of women working, a review of the Central Waterfront in Newburyport in 1770 reveals that over 1/3 of the businesses on the Central Waterfront were women-owned and operated. It's not totally clear to me, without doing a lot more research, how many of these were single women, or women who were running their businesses as part of a family enterprise, but these are women whose businesses are registered in their own name. Sarah Atkins, Elizabeth Burt, Elizabeth Watkins, Elizabeth Roberts, and Mary Fisher all advertised in the newspaper, sold potash and clothing, rented warehouse space, and in at least one case, Mary Morgridge, rented enslaved labor. And either in the absence of menfolk or, because they were absent or had never existed, they were running these businesses in their own name. So in this tableau, in the sculpture here, the third figure is that of a flower seller. And there was a sort of a conversation about trying to represent working women who were poor, women who were working outside the home in sort of an untraditional way. So she's not working as a servant anymore, she's on the street selling flowers. And a woman selling anything out of doors, outside a location, would have been a little bit suspect. I think you did an excellent job of sort of portraying her as someone who might be making everyone a little uncomfortable. There might be some negotiations there. So the woman in this portrait in the sculpture is someone whose circumstances have led her to support herself in any way she can. There were a number of women, just like today, who would sell whatever they could get for free. In some cases, they would make pottery. Clay and fire are fairly universally available. Flowers, herbs, and some women that would have small farms and would come to the city and into the town and sell eggs, various things like that. There are very few records about poor and transient women in Newburyport during this time. But there's one great record from the Bartlett family of an elderberry seller who would come into the community from the countryside to sell her goods that she'd grown or foraged herself. So some of these women, and then they would give her turkey. This was for goose at Christmas. That's the tie into the Bartlett family. But this was this idea that every year they'd wait for this woman to come in from the countryside to sell her wares, and then she'd leave again. And obviously she was a charity, a figure of charity, because they gave her food. Some of these women were considered appropriate recipients of charity outdoors. The town of Newburyport, Newburyport, had overseers of the poor. So there was, you could sort of go down and apply for food without actually going into the poorhouse. Sometimes if it was inappropriate, if they had a place to live, they demonstrated a place to live but couldn't eat, they could be given some out-of-doors support. Sometimes they would receive modest financial support or private charity while they remained independent. The elderberry seller was a turkey, received the turkey at Christmas. Other women living like this on the edge turned to prostitution or begging and were often consigned to the poorhouse or the almshouse when they were reported as a nuisance, which happened often when they were begging. So it's possible that this woman is a farmer from Newbury or Amesbury who grows and gathers flowers and sells them at the market, but it is more likely that she is impoverished or transient, living on the edge of poverty and respectability. So, I'm not sure I can't give you a women in the 18th century were. What I can say is that there were laws that constrained women's legal identity. There were laws that constrained women's freedom. In the case of enslaved women, obviously it applied even more to them. But there were always ways that women's lives were informed by class, race, and luck. In some cases, personality, other elements. Marriage, obviously who you married. Anybody that's read Jane Austen knows that who you married made a huge difference. And I will also say that change was also coming. Mary Wollstonecraft her writings were available by the time Ruth Hooper Dalton's lifetime. There was a real effort in New York State, where she lived for a while, to require that property that had passed from a father to a daughter, even though women could not legally own property, could not be disposed of without her consent. And that was a huge change. That was the beginning of saying women can actually own property legally. And in fact, the judge would meet with a woman in private, separately. That was part of the law, so she could not be coerced by her family in the moment. So there was already sort of beginnings of legal change afoot. There's also just in a town like Newburyport, just look at the way women actually lived. Look at the way that they are represented, not necessarily in the law books, but in the newspaper, in petitions to court systems, in family diaries, letters, correspondence. And you get a very different picture than you would get if you looked at these people solely as a product of of the legal standard of their time. So there's a wonderful quote, I think I used it on my catalog exposition there, but Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist has something to say about the law of coverture. The character Mr. Bumble is informed that the law supposes your wife acts under your direction. In other words, your wife is subject to the law of coverture, so it's your fault what she did. Mr. Bumble replies, if the law supposes that, the law is an ass. If that is the eyes of the law is a bachelor. So that's what I have to say about that. I'd love to answer any questions. I think one of the beautiful things about the archival records that we have here and at the Museum of Old Newbury is the ways that you can find bits about people's lives who are not officially recorded in the great biographies of the day. And sometimes the picture that emerges is one of great personality and intimacy, even though nobody ever sat down and wrote the story of their life. So, yes?
Would you talk about the clothing?
Sure. So there is a portrait somewhere in the world of Ruth Hooper Dalton, and I will give you $500 if you find it. There is a portrait of Ruth Hooper Dalton. There's a portrait of her mother, her sister, her father, her brother, her brother's wife. and a couple of her children, so I feel quite sure that there's one of her. But we don't have it. So Jeff worked with Lois Vallejo, who was on the board of the museum and is a costume historian, to sort of look at the ways that the status of these women could be represented through dress. And in Ruth Hoover Dalton's case, there's a portrait of her sister Alice, who lived on State Street. She lived up at 32 State Street. It was painted by Copley, I believe, so it's very beautifully rendered. And so her dress is based on that dress, I believe. You could probably talk more to the clothing than I could. There's a portrait of a contemporary Boston enslaved woman who was the model for the dress of the enslaved woman here. And then the flower seller, the dresses worn by poor people tend to stay the same for a very, very, very long time. So that was a fairly easy outfit to come up with, because any working class woman between sort of 1690 and 1790 was wearing about the same thing. So, and had many interchangeable pieces.
Just like to add a couple of things to that. The enslaved woman, there was a lot of discussion about her clothing. If she's living in a house of a rich person, then her clothing would have been higher class than the enslaved woman outside of the house. So that was a bit of controversy. The Dalton woman, her dress would be much more elaborate and pleated and much more better fabrics and many more layers than the other two women. A lot of education went into this costuming of women, because it changed very rapidly from one age to another, and determining what they might have looked like or what they dressed at 1771 was probably one of the hardest things to achieve.
It's tough too, because you have a 20-year-old who's going to be dressing differently, even in the same class, is going to be dressing very differently in 1771 than a 60-year-old.
As you can see, there's all kinds of mixed messages when it comes to that.
Yeah, it's very hard, but I think that's beautiful. That's what makes history so rich and so worth pursuing, is that there's so many iterations, so many variations, and you can make broad sweeping statements, but then it's so much more rewarding to go down and really get into the individuality of the people you're talking about.
And then the Dalton woman has 5 layers of dress, whereas some of the other women have less.
Yeah, there's also a lot of signaling going on there. Elite women had outfits they couldn't possibly put on by themselves, which tells everyone that they have a staff who's going to be, doing this for them. Where the enslaved woman and the poor, the saleswoman are, not going to have anyone dressing them necessarily in the morning. So, where are the ties? Are they in the front? Are they in the back? Is it something that can be loose in pregnancy? There's a whole language around that, but we had some great conversations around that. I know less about Logan than Lois for sure, but I know more than I did before. Yes.
So adding to the complication, you mentioned that you used a model that there was a portrait of from a Copley painting. It's known that there was a blue dress in particular that the women he painted would borrow. And so the same dress would be used. So if you see some portraits, they may be in the American women at MFA for all I know, but they're in the same dress. So I don't know how long that would have been used for, how many years, getting back to the point of if the fashion changed quickly, it may not be as representative as you might think. So we've got to look at who painted it and what was going on with their models, because they wanted to dress in, if not the latest fashion, something that was very elegant. I'm just using that as
I'm trying to remember if she was in a blue dress. I think she might have been. We'll look it up. But
that blue dress is very famous.
At the very least, it was something that she was willing to be painted in, which tells you that it's something that suited her, her taste. So I think it's still broadly, even if it is a blue dress, it's still broadly appropriate. I will say, the Hoopers are not a terribly attractive family. You're going to be struck down for saying that. And of course, because there's a sweat in the family, they're also cousins of mine. So I would criticize my own family here. But anybody who spends 5 seconds in Newburyport, they're related to me somehow. So the father, King, Hoover. I mean, the men are painted very rotund, very round faced, 5'6" chins, very sort of fat and happy. The women are painted much more flatteringly, but with the same round face. That tells me there was maybe a little artistic license that went into that. I mean, there's definitely I don't know, they were plump and pleasant looking as a family.
But didn't that show that they were well off? So because the fat babies were really...
It did, but you don't find portraits of really round women during this time routinely unless they really were round. I mean, people, that's a broad statement, and I'm certainly willing to be proven wrong, but I think that the women in this family were either very, very different from men, or there was a little bit taken off the sides.
Air rods.
The other subject matter that was controversy amongst the group was what kind of hats they were wearing.
Yeah.
That was a big deal.
And that is entirely out of my realm of expertise. Yesterday was the first day I put a hat on in about 20 years. But yes, I mean, hats, just like everything else, had social significance and style.
Signaling.
Yeah, for sure. There was a question over here.
Where did the Dalton House go from the family home to whatever it is today?
So the Dalton House, I am not an expert on the history of the house or Tristram himself, but I know that they sold it when they relocated. They left Newburyport to go sort of live in Washington, D.C. He was an overseer of Washington, D.C., and then that real estate market there collapsed, and they lost all their stuff in the shipwreck, and it was a terrible time. But it was sold to the Brown family, who owned it until 1890-something, when it became a club. So it went from the Dalton family to the Brown family to the club, pretty much unbroken line. That's my understanding. Feel free to, any Dalton Club members in the room that want to correct me on that? Does that sound right, everybody? Okay, good. I just said that on Facebook, so somebody out there is chewing their fingernails, which may be correct me. Yes.
So, it's interesting because that statue is set late 18th century, 1770, 1780. By 1850, we were getting a lot of Irish immigration and indentured servitude. When I look at the statue, I look at the flower one and say, "Oh, that's kind of an Irish indentured servant." Did you find anything in your research about indentured servants?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. But indentured servants tend, unless they're poor orphans, to be men. So a lot of, women, boys who needed placement would be sent into, given an indenture or an apprenticeship, depending on their status. Girls would be sent into service, which was less sort of official. But what you find a lot is indentured servants running away, and ads for their capture, which are brilliant records because it usually says what they're wearing. And sometimes they're terrible. It says, John Copper ran away, he's wearing a blue shirt and ripped breeches, he has one leg, one eye, and he's got one coin that he stole from my bedside. I mean, really, they're incredible resources, but they're not usually Irish. At this point, most of them are native born. Yeah, the Irish were the wealthy, actually, at this point. We've got Patrick Tracy. There was a sort of an Irish aristocracy here in the 18th century. Yes.
So different topic, but a woman of that era, was she legally allowed to divorce her husband? And if so, on what grounds? Do you know?
So again, this is a very interesting question because the 18th century and the 19th century are actually more restrictive than the 17th century. We all think about Puritan New England as being this very buttoned up type kind of society. But marriages were sort of annulled pretty regularly in Puritan New England, where the judges had the discretion to just say, this clearly isn't working out, go your separate ways. But they weren't, I don't think they tended to be seen as sort of legal divorces. They would just sort of allow people to get out of their marriages, especially if they were early on or no children. In the 18th and 19th century, there were divorces. They were extremely rare. and they were extremely difficult to prove because a husband legally could do everything but deprive his wife of her actual life because he owned everything she wore, he could strip her naked and throw her out of the house, and he was within his legal rights because he owned her clothes. And in fact, that was the case that sort of broke divorce apart, is that this happened to an aristocratic woman. Her husband took everything, her children, her clothes, and threw her out. And her family said, this can't be right, this can't carry on. And that changed divorce law in England, I believe in the 1840s, but that was, before that, you had to really prove egregious cruelty. And then often it was a criminal act. I think it was a criminal case, not a civil divorce case. So it was very rare. It did happen, not terribly often. Usually you just had to wait it out when your spouse would die of something or other. Both King Hooper and Michael Dalton had 4 wives each. There were often multiple marriages in the course of one's life. That's not a satisfactory answer, I'm sure, but I can't think of any divorces in the 18th century in Newbury and Newburyport.
No.
No, I can't think of
I
any.
know it sort of came up, in the news right now. There's, a ruling by one of the courts that, someone who's had a history of spousal abuse or restraining order against them can't be deprived of a firearm.
Right.
And then,
Yes, I was just reading about that.
Yeah, well, when I read further, it also said that until 1871, beating your wife was not an offense.
That's correct, but it was not an offense if it was considered reasonable. So you could reasonably correct her, but there were absolutely people who were brought in for abusing their wives and children. It's not like you could do anything to get away with it. It was that there was sort of a standard of reasonable correction, and this is where the whole rule of thumb thing comes in, where you're supposed to be able to, stick as big as your thumb.
Plus the people that determined it was reasonable were
Totally. But again, I think there were also a lot of women did quite well for themselves because they had conscientious husbands, fathers, and sons. And the biggest trouble you would get in as a woman of a certain class at this time is if your husband, your husband could have been a wonderful husband. If he died and you didn't get along with your son, you basically belonged to your son when your husband died. And if your husband didn't very carefully specify what you were entitled to and make a third party responsible for the administration of that estate, your son got to decide how the estate was administered. It could literally set in the draft. And it happened all the time. You see a lot of very, very detailed wills that husbands made, which probably were to protect the interests of their wives.
This is where the expression rule of thumb comes from. I don't know which colonies or states it was in effect or the time period, but the rule of the law was that a husband could not discipline a wife with a stick that was any thicker than the average thumb.
And again, I think rather than thinking about women as being sort of legal non-persons, you have to think of them as children. Almost similar to the way we think about children, let's say, into the 1950s. Like, you really couldn't kill your child. You couldn't beat them, until to the point where they couldn't function. But, a certain amount of physical correction was to be expected and was actually quite, encouraged and that sort of thing. So I think that really, the idea was that women legally were children. And children legally were children. Yes.
I think I remember a few talks about that many women inherited the ordinaries or the taverns or the brewing. The husband would die, and then that many of them were very successful in the ordinaries.
So that is a great point. I think one of the saddest things that happened it happened in most societies, but I see it in this one town. is that in the 17th century, we all come here with our, religious ideals. There's actually, I do not want to oversell this whole thing like Puritans were great feminists. They absolutely 100% were not. But this was a frontier, it was a farming community. There was also a sort of Puritan idea, a religious idea that women were the spiritual equals of men, that women and men were equal in the sight of God, and also that women were physical beings, they were sexual beings, they were capable of hard work, they were capable of pleasure. So there was a different, legally there was still incredible barriers to women being very successful in the 17th century, but anytime you're working on a farm, women are not going to, that's a huge generalization. Frontier communities tend to have a lot more rights for women than settled industrial cities, right? Because there's just more need. Women have clearly demonstrated and must continue to demonstrate that they work hard, that they can make decisions in a pinch, right? It's very hard to put, this is part of why the first states to grant women the vote in the United States were Western frontier states. Because women, by necessity, in frontiers, sort of have to be able to do things, conduct business, and run households, and that sort of thing. So the closer you are to the edge, ironically, the more rights women tend to have. And in the 17th century, taverns were often really run by women because women were the brewers of beer. So women were brewers, it was considered sort of a form of cooking. Men were not brewers, it was food preservation. And so if a woman cooked, made a really good beer, like Diana Scoffin here in Newbury, then they really have the secret to a successful tavern. So they were de facto the head of the tavern, although they never legally owned it. So women could certainly, again, even if they didn't legally own it, they were still running it. Sometimes women did own it on paper, although if anybody had filed a suit, they could have taken it, potentially. A son who wanted to claim it, maybe as part of his inheritance, could have taken it legally. So it's just this gray area. But absolutely, women in the 17th century, before industrial brewing, ran the taverns and brewed beer.
I'm just wondering, do you have any insight as to what created all the deaths with their kids, and ironically at 11 months?
Yeah, 11 to 14 months, they lost most of their children. I don't, but what I would say is sometimes when, it's a little easier if you see so many infants that die at birth, because then you can imagine this is a person who had multiple C-sections today. They just were not able to labor, in a way that sustained life. There could have been a genetic component. These families were, there's a little more than the average child death in this family. So I don't know if there's a genetic component or if there's just bad luck. There was a sort of 50% child mortality rate, so it's not crazy unusual to have that many of your children die, but they were quite unlucky in that way. I love a good death record. In the 19th century, they start listing how people die, which is brilliant because it's not always accurate. Sometimes there's this whole section where they say babies die of teething, which is nobody dies of teething. But what would happen is the teething would happen at the same time as a lot of these sort of diseases would come around, so they blame the teething. So you can get a hint about how people maybe not do that right.
You forgot.
What did I forget?
How come the sculpture is called what it's called?
Negotiations? Well, first of all, because I think we had to negotiate with each other quite a bit to make it happen. I think the negotiations is an homage to our friendship. Actually, it was because everyone in that sculpture is negotiating with everyone else. There's and it seemed like, and women are negotiating their power. They're negotiating, this woman is negotiating the sale. That's pretty straightforward, the sale of flowers, but she's also sort of, the slave woman is negotiating with the child, who, Ruth, the elite woman is negotiating for her space, sort of, and they're all in situations where they're negotiating with each other in the society. So I think how's that?
Close enough.
Okay, what's your take on it?
Well, I think that what I remember you saying was that in order for women to survive in the society of the time, they were negotiating
Yeah.
all the time in order to make their way into society as a whole.
And I think that you see that nowhere more than in Ruth Hoover Dalton's letters, where she's always trying to get some intel that's going to help her husband and her family. You know, she's always kind of negotiating for that little bit of information, and that was the currency of the time. And luckily, it was in letters, so they survived. But there was a lot of that. Yes.
Given the age of her son, what year was this project within?
So the sculpture was set in 1771. That was the year where we have an enslaved woman. Ruth Dalton has a son of approximately the right age. So that was my pedantic foot stomping, though we have to start with real people and a given time before we can go anywhere else. That was important to me.
Bethany, what women's diaries would you recommend we try to find and read in the 18th century? I know Abigail Adams is.
Yeah, Abigail Adams is phenomenal. You also often get references to female relationships in men's letters. So there's often a paragraph at the end of a letter that says, you know, Mrs. D sends the blah, 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 in hopes that she'll see you at the, there's ways that you could.
The diaries?
Diaries. There's some sort of autobiographical works from women who wrote about their lives, especially women that went to sea. So there's Elizabeth Bray. I don't know what her years are here. It's more 19th century than 18th.
1750s. Yeah. And then Alice Brown, who was also got the mural now.
Yeah, I guess maybe letters more than diaries. But there are some, like the nonagenarian stories are great, recollections of the nonagenarian, Sarah Emery. So she is recording the recollections of her mother, who's 90. And who knew all these people personally and tells you what she knew of them. She talks about Ruth Hoover. So, things like that. There's not a whole lot. I can't think of an 18th century, Sharon Spildauer is going to watch this and run, because I'm sure there are some, but I think collections of letters are really a good place to go.
Well, join me in thanking Bethany. Black, same place, same station.
Thank you. Wish me luck with my soggy walls.